here. Oh man, okay. Share. All right, now more. Hide. Is this like the 14th professor that you've had to teach this to? Okay. What?
Most of mine just given up.
Okay, so yes, it was this like really wild article that told you all these like kind of crazy scenarios of parents and like the lengths that they would go to send their kids to these Ivy League schools. And what they would do, basically the thesis of the article was that these parents will put a lot of money into their kids into these niche sports, but that avenue of getting into an Ivy League school has exploded. So it's actually not a very productive way. So they'll spend all this money on trying to get their kids in fencing, and then it's super competitive in fencing right now. Okay, but what happened is this. Okay, so I guess I should start here. So the first thing that they said was they published this. On October 22nd, we noted and corrected another error in the story. The article originally referenced Olympic-sized backyard hockey rinks, but although the private rinks are large and equipped with floodlights and generators, they are not Olympic size. So this was the first correction that they corrected. Then on the 30th, they corrected, I guess we'll start at the top now. So I'm jumping around. Okay.
I saw people talking about this on Twitter, but I had no idea what they were talking about.
Okay, so effective November 1st, after The Atlantic published the article, new information emerged that raised serious concerns about its accuracy and about the credibility of its author, Ruth Shallitt Barrett. We have decided to retract the article. We cannot attest to the trustworthiness and credibility of the author, and therefore we cannot attest to the veracity of this article. We draw a distinction between retraction and removal. We believe that scrubbing the article from the internet would not meet our standards for transparency, and we believe it is important to preserve access to the article for the historical record. We have decided to take down the online version, but to make available a PDF of the article as it appears in our November 2020 issue. We are sharing with our readers what we have learned so you may understand how we came to this decision. We have established that Barrett deceived The Atlantic and its readers about a section of the story that concerns a person referred to as Sloan. And then it goes into what happened. The original version of the article stated that Sloan had a son. Sloan confirmed this to be true to the fact-checking department, but then everything kind of starts to unravel about this character named Sloan. So what happened is that this person named Sloan wanted to be anonymous for the article, and the journalist was like, well, what if you talk about what if we create a fictitious son so as to give you more anonymity, because then no one will know who you were, because no one in your life will know that you have a son because you actually don't have a son. So they created this whole fictitious character. And there's a lot of deceptions that the journalist kind of argues is for anonymity, but actually become factual errors. And the person that this said Sloan lied to the fact-checking department about it as well. And I mean, it's pretty long, right? So there's a lot of these kind of issues in here. During the initial fact-checking process, we corroborated many details of Sloan's story with sources other than Sloan, but the checking of some details of Sloan's story relied solely on interviews and other communications with Sloan or her husband or both of them, right? So this is a pretty big deal. They printed it in their magazine, their November issue of the magazine, and they had to retract the whole story, right? So these things still happen. It's pretty wild, right? So I just wanted to give this as one of the examples of like, this happens on a national scale. It's still happening today. If you're gonna give someone anonymity, that means like changing their name, right? Or not using their name. It does not mean making up things about their story or their life, right? We are in the pursuit of truth. We are not gonna make things up. All right. The other kind of national ongoing one, I think, did you, Erin, you had Jason Blair, is that, yeah. So we've read about some of the classic journalists in history who created and fabricated lots of stories and had illustrious careers that broke down into shambles. Well, there's one, I don't know if I mentioned her in here, but there's a journalist for the New York Times named Rukmini Callimachi. And she has become an expert on reporting on terrorism. So for the last almost 20 years, she's reported on terrorism, and she's seen as one of the experts on terrorism, on ISIS, on Syria. She's been reporting on it for a long time. So Rukmini Callimachi has done a lot of stuff. She gets interviewed for The Daily often. She worked on this podcast series called Caliphate, and it follows this Canadian who allegedly got recruited by ISIS and went to ISIS and then was involved in a lot of pretty atrocious things in ISIS. So I'm giving a warning about violence. We're going to listen to the kind of the first portion of this, because the first person you hear from in this is this Canadian that got recruited by ISIS.
This is prepare you to kill people. Is there anything?
We had dolls. Yeah, we had dolls to crack us out. We also have cutouts of ballistics gels. It would feel a lot like human. And inside the ballistic gels, they'd have sacks where major organs would be. And then you could slice, practice, behead, stab, and just practice. So it kind of felt like what a medical student would do. And you had to know how to use a knife on a human.
Test 1, 2.
How's this? Okay?
Yeah,
Okay, can I go up to the image?
of course. So can you describe what we're looking at?
Yeah. It's a man standing in the desert. He's clad in black. His face is covered. All you see is a slit for his eyes. He has a knife in his hand, and he's stabbing it in the direction of the camera. At his feet is another man.
I wish I had more time.
This one is wearing an orange jumpsuit.
I wish I could have the hope of freedom and see my family once again.
His name is James Foley. He's an American freelance journalist, and he's been kidnapped by the Islamic State.
This is James Wright Foley, an American citizen of your country.
And he's about to be executed.
Any aggression towards the Islamic State will result in the bloodshed of your people.
This is basically how the world meets ISIS.
Yeah.
And now,
Breaking news out of London, a deadly terror attack overnight.
years later, ISIS is
A van plowing into a crowd of people out simply enjoying a Saturday night.
a bunch of guys in a van who are plowing into pedestrians on London Bridge, pulling out kitchen knives, stabbing people on the streets where they live.
2 suspects in San Bernardino's mass shooting identified.
It's a husband and wife
I heard rapid shooting, just boom, 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 boom.
who head to a Christmas party in San Bernardino, California, and come in guns blazing.
Breaking news, an explosion at the very busy Port Authority bus terminal.
It's an immigrant living in Brooklyn who straps on a suicide vest and tries to detonate it in a subway tunnel in Times Square, just a block away from my office.
He told investigators he detonated an explosive device in the name of ISIS.
This is ISIS now. And
I truly believe this is a defining moment in history.
ISIS is the latest incarnation
This is clearly a case of good versus evil,
of a war we have been fighting now for nearly 2 decades.
and make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
Okay, so she's worked on this for 2 decades, right? She's been doing this kind of reporting for 2 decades. This series, Caliphate, follows that first person that talks about killing in the very beginning, and he is this Canadian. What's happened, though, is that I guess I'll start here. In this series, that Canadian goes by Abu Hayzuyafa, and he tells Callimachi that he had executed 2 men. But then, in a subsequent interview with a Canadian interviewer, he told that interview that he hadn't killed anybody at all. And so all of a sudden, this whole series that's based on these like very detailed, very gruesome personal accounts is now questioned. A lot of people are saying, well, what was it? Did you or didn't you, right? And Kalamaki says, well, we caught him in this, we interviewed him before the government knew to look for him. We caught him in this in-between time where he'd just come home and he'd flown under the radar and he wasn't worried about the ramifications of being honest, right? That's her argument. But a lot of articles now are coming out about people who have worked with her and people about this particular case and looking into other articles and other stories that she's pursued and investigated. They're starting to question how she goes about getting the materials that she got. So this article, this is from September, or this one's from October. Derek Henry Flood was, or Flood. Oh, I say Flood. It's Flood. That's how you say Flood, right? Derek Henry Flood was hired to do some fact checking. So he was in Syria and he, you know, wrote Miss Kalamaki, and a bunch of people didn't want to work with him, but she did. And then he writes, or the assignment Mr. Flood recalled thinking was both, okay, so she sent him to the local market to ask about a Canadian Islamic State fighter called Abu Hazayafad. The assignment, Mr. Flood recalled thinking, was both hopeless and quite strange in its specificity, since the extremist group had been forced out of Manbij 2 years earlier. He was getting $250 a day, so he gamely roamed the bazaar, reporting on all he saw and heard. She was singularly focused. She only wanted things that very narrowly supported this kid in Canada's wild stories, he told me in an interview. So kind of goes on to talk about what he saw, but what she was interested in. So she knew that she had to corroborate his stories. So she was looking for things that did that. But what happened is that a lot of other people a lot of ISIS defectors that they interviewed, no one had heard of this person, right? So she heard this kind of very, very detailed, really unique testimony from this person, right? And so she thought, this needs to be told, right? But she went about trying to fact check it, and maybe that fact checking was flawed. Maybe she believed something that was a little too good to be true, right? Maybe she was given access to something that maybe wasn't real. So her decades of reporting, I think she's won 4 Pulitzers, are now all being questioned. The New York Times is going through all of her stuff, questioning the reporting she did. There was another series that she wrote that was based on, they were exploring what was left over from ruins after a building had ruins of a city in Syria after conflict had been there. And she found a briefcase of receipts. And this whole story is based on what the receipts prove or disprove. And all of those stories are being looked at. So, you know, we read about Jason Blair from the 1980s, but these things are still happening today, right? And it's really tricky because we live in a world where people talk about fake news, right? The burden of proof is high. It should be high. We're trying to tell things that are real, and we're trying to get to the bottom of things. Even though you want people to read your articles, you can't go about pursuing what's true. What would you do if someone, yeah, Sophia? They could, and they have done that in the past.
It would be really a case of like confirmation bias and not like actually malicious, like falsifying evidence or something.
So that's why I think this is a little more nuanced. Things like, I don't think Jason Blair was there was a Washington Post article, journalist in the 90s who wrote a piece about a drug addict who didn't even exist, right? That is just totally making something up and fabricating something entirely. This, you know, maybe it was based in a truth or something that she believed to be true. It was someone else's experience, right? So I think that the fringes of the ethical debate, like, at what point do you publish it? If you have something, someone allows you into ISIS, they were an ISIS recruit. They can tell you something that you have not heard in the media yet. You have not been able to hear that experience. What would your burden be before you published it? Or how might you contextualize it? Manny?
Being transparent about, like, this is like the testimony that one person if and if you have been able to corroborate your story or not.
Mhm.
Also, maybe not even publishing if you're unable to actually verify the authenticity of it.
Cool.
Like, I'd look to see if the events that they're talking about actually happened in some manner. Like, names could be changed, or they could be going under an alias when talking with people. And there's no real guarantee that what they're saying to you during that interview is properly true. So just ask them, so instead of asking about to see if it's connected to the person's name or so, ask about the events in particular and see if they actually happened.
But also, like, they couldn't find people that could confirm that this person even existed at all, right? Kendall?
Yeah, it seems like it would be pretty difficult to find, because the guy used to be a racist. Like, how many people are just like around, or that you have access to that used to be an ISIS at the same time in the same place? Because I mean, they're a global organization that would know him. So I feel like no matter what, like, you can never be fully sure that that person like existed unless they give you a name of someone that's currently an ISIS. But like, no one's gonna have to that's currently an ISIS, you know.
So what might you ask? Like, how would you confirm this? Like, what are some things that you might do?
I mean, dates.
Dates, right? Like, this person left Canada, you could probably prove that, right? If someone gives you an account of something that was common, if that account is similar to other accounts of people that are defectors that are sharing, right? That might be something. Cool.
ISIS is typically a pretty public group, so like the events in question can probably be cross-referenced with other news sources or reports of other possible defectors, or like to see if they actually occurred would give some credence to the story.
Yeah. So yeah, I think so. And what's interesting about the Caliphate series actually is that the journalist is exploring whether or not the account is true. So like she elevates it as a true account and goes on this journey kind of fact checking, allowing you into it. But there is a question and a doubt that exists in the series about the veracity of the narrator. Like, is he reliable? And they do like lots of checking about that, which is why the New York Times hasn't taken it down yet, or why the New York Times is, they defend the work right now, because there is a question in it of whether or not he can be trusted. But this is something that's ongoing. So if anything else comes out before the end of the semester, I'll keep you posted on it, because it's a pretty big deal for one of the top ISIS reporters. Now all of her work is getting scrutinized. They're looking through to make sure that whether or not she was looking for things that made her story better, maybe negligently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems like even if he was lying to her, if the whole story is about like them fact checking, she obviously did her due diligence. Like we were talking about it last week, that like if you are sued because something you print is wrong, but you can prove that you did like your due diligence to make sure that that was correct information and it still ended up being wrong, then you're not liable for that. So it seems like she's done that. Maybe she hasn't. I haven't listened to
Well, the person that worked with her said that she was only looking for things that confirmed what she thought to be true.
That's the question of whether it was like, was she going to bias sources or
So
something?
why did people not catch on to this when she released it?
Because the person that she interviewed hadn't spoken to anybody else. It wasn't until a second interview where the person told the other interviewer that he had never executed anybody. So that's what started the rabbit hole. Yep.
So could it have been that he was telling the truth the first time, and then when it started to get more publicity, he tried to change the story?
That's what.
And then that would mean that she didn't.
Well, the question becomes, how do you
Yeah.
prove that he was telling the truth?
Exactly.
Well, I mean, that kind of makes like sense that if he was starting to get more like people who are interested in his story, that he wouldn't want to be like continuously incriminating himself.
I mean, that's her argument. But so I think, and that's why this guy who worked with her came out and wrote an op-ed about it. There's just, I think it's interesting that we now have a person who has 2 decades of reporting that is going through that process of being questioned. Sophia?
guy's motive was to even have this interview.
In the first place at all.
What was he getting out of it, except for like self-intimidating himself and like acknowledging everything that he's done?
I don't know. I will link to this op-ed that goes through them questioning all of the, I can export it as a PDF and put it on Canvas. And also, I mean, it's a really interesting podcast, whether or not, I don't know. It's a really interesting podcast. I don't know. I mean, he came off as a person who, there was a slew of people that joined ISIS that then defected that came out to share why they did that and then how horrible it actually was. So I think that he maybe was just another one of those stories saying like, you don't realize how bad it is. Like you don't know until you get there.
How do you really verify that he was I guess is the question.
That's the whole question. Exactly. And you know, they interview other defectors that could be in other places. I just think it's interesting. All right. I think both of those two things, I think it's kind of wild that the Atlantic published an article that they had to take down. They got past the fact checkers. I think that, and that's so recent, that's in this month's issue. And then I think this is kind of a more nuanced version of, was she at fault? Was she doing confirmation bias? Is it her fault or is it the person that she interviewed? All right, so now we get to law. All right, will you hit the lights? All right. Okay. So, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This, okay, so our Constitution, does anyone know when our Constitution was written? Yes, 1787. And then 1791, we passed the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And in that was the First Amendment. The First Amendment really has 5 things that it protects. So this first line, Congress shall, is that a question? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Basically, we can have whatever religious beliefs we believe, and our government cannot have an official religion, right? So freedom of religion, that's the first one. Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. We can say what we want to say, and publications generally can publish what they want to. They don't need permission from the government of prior consent. We can say things that we want to say, and we should be able to publish pretty much what we want to publish. Publications can publish what they want to say without the government. We can assemble peaceably. So you can protest, you can get outside and talk about the things that you don't like about things. You're allowed to do all of that as long as it's peaceful. And then we also, that 5th right of petitioning the government. We have a right to tell our lawmakers things that we're unhappy about, things that we don't like. We're allowed to tell them we disagree with things, we wish it was different. We can argue with what they're doing. But that middle one, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, this is the most important legal document on the books for journalism.
And it's not entirely true. They have done things like the clear and present danger clause that does abridge speech and press.
Yeah, so, okay, maybe we'll hold on questions for a little bit. But what's the name of the New Supreme Court Justice? Yes. Okay, so her legal philosophy is called originalism, right? Which is thinking about the Constitution as it was intended, as it was intentionally written, okay? So the person that we can attribute the First Amendment to is James Madison, who later became our 4th president. He didn't intend for this to be unfettered. He didn't intend for the freedom of speech to be totally free. There's always been criticism. There's always been some limitations. And right now, some of those limitations that we're gonna, like the nuances and limitations of the freedom of speech and freedom of the press are what is gonna constitute this class that we're gonna talk about, which are kind of broad strokes, are gonna be defamation, hurting somebody's reputation. Defamation is hurting somebody's reputation, copyright, and then also privacy is gonna become a part of that. All right, so does anyone know what vaudeville is? All right.
Wasn't that originally like pretty much a strip show?
I mean, there probably was vaudeville that was a strip show, but no, that was not intended to be a strip show. A strip, yeah. I don't know. Kendall?
So it's like a type of performance, pretty famous 1800s, I think, right?
Yeah, 1890s, like late 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, there were some more promiscuous vaudeville people, but it was just like, kind of, when I think of vaudeville, I think kind of circusy, but not the circus, like circus on stage.
It was like the biggest form of entertainment before there was television, really. So it was all these little talent shows, and people would kind of create their talent show, and they would go and travel around to different towns. And, you know, the bigger the crowds got, the more famous these people got, and the more you'd want to go see their show. So these are kind of some examples. Sometimes it was singing, sometimes it was dancing, lots of like animals performing. These are kind of some examples. So like a vaudeville act would come to town and you would go see that vaudeville act. And maybe you'd heard about it from other cities or other papers. Okay. All right. Okay. So vaudeville. We are going to talk about these sisters called the Cherry Sisters. Okay. So the Cherry Sisters, they became an incredibly famous vaudeville act that set what is called a precedent, which we'll get to, in the legal world for freedom of speech. So the Vaudeville Sisters, there's actually 5 of them. And they grew up on a farm in Iowa. And when their dad died, they wanted to go search for a long lost brother. And they figured they could find him if they created a famous enough vaudeville act to get to the World Fair in Chicago. So they threw together an act, started practicing together, and started traveling around. There was originally 4 of them. They left one of their sisters at home to watch the farm. And then they became really famous as 3 of them. And they did songs that had dramatic readings. And what started happening is they started becoming more and more well-known. Their audiences grew and grew, and they became, you know, pretty far-reaching famous. But what critics were saying is that they were saying that the audiences were growing because they were so bad, that they were such terrible performers that everybody wanted to come out to see the like atrocious Cherry Sisters. So a lot of editors at the time would write a critique about them. So this is from the Cedar Rapids Gazette from 1896. In some indefinable instance of modesty, could have warned them that they were acting the part of monkeys. It does seem like the overshoes thrown at them would convey the idea. So like, they were so bad, people were throwing their shoes at them, right? Like people were throwing things at them, people were booing them. But the Cherry Sisters, they were like, well, our crowds are getting bigger and bigger. This must not be real. And so they actually sued the paper. They sued the paper for libel, which is a form of defamation. And they said, we're actually really great performers. If you came out and you saw us perform, you would know that we were really great. And we can prove that we're great because our audiences are so big. So in this case, they sued the paper for libel, and then they ended up dropping it, and they kind of created it as part of their act. They created a mock judge that decided on the case. But 2 years later, they kept performing, their audiences kept growing. Billy Hamilton, another editor, published this criticism, and this criticism published in other papers as well. So other papers picked up this criticism. The mouths of their rancid features opened like caverns, and sounds of the wailing of damned souls issued therefrom. Like pretty harsh words, right? All right, so the sisters were pissed, and so they sued this newspaper for $15,000 at the time. And they sued the newspaper. The local court decided against them, and they actually appealed it all the way up to the Iowa Supreme Court. In case you don't know how our court system works, I threw this in here. We have a bunch of different local courts that you go to depending on your infraction. So depending on what you do, you'll go to a local court. If the judge at the court decides something that you disagree with, they decide not in your favor, you can appeal that decision, which means ask a higher court to revisit it and look at the case again. And sometimes when it goes to an appeals court, goes to a higher level, sometimes the court will overturn the previous ruling, or sometimes they will push it back down and tell them to revisit the case, or sometimes they will agree against the plaintiff and it'll be over. But so as you move up, you start at your local court, you can appeal to Superior Court, appeal to the Court of Appeals, you can appeal to the state Supreme Court, and then after that, you can appeal to the federal Supreme Court, right? It's also different if you create a state criminal offense or a federal criminal offense, but the Supreme Court is actually an appellate court. So you appeal things to the Supreme Court. So they appealed all the way up to the Iowa Supreme Court, and they lost their lawsuit. The Supreme Court decided that there is a right to comment and criticize, especially on something that is done in public. So the court wrote, one who goes up on the stage to exhibit himself in the public and who gives any kind of performance to which the public is invited may be freely criticized. So if you're doing it in public and you're inviting people to come, you're inviting people to be able to criticize you. You're opening up that conversation. And this idea, he went into basically, the ruling goes into say, if it's not done with wicked purpose or malice, and it must be based in truth. So there must be some truth to it. But this idea of the right to comment and criticize became what's called a legal precedent. Cool.
Is this the public figures precedent, or is this like a...
We're gonna keep going, and then I think it'll all make sense if we just keep going. All right, so again, in law, there's rulings, which like a judge can rule something, but there's also a precedent. So a precedent is a legal principle or rule that's created by a court's decision. So now, whenever something is brought to a judge, the judge is going to rule on that case, but sometimes we'll look at previous cases and previous rulings to determine how people have handled that in the past. That previous idea of court and law is what's called precedent. So this case from the Cherry Sisters, it was 100 years after the First Amendment, but it created a legal precedent. All of a sudden, there was something in the legal rhetoric around having the right to criticize a public figure and having a right to criticize something that happened in a public space. So precedent, if you talk about law, it often comes up. People will talk about the precedent. What has happened in the past? How have people ruled on this in the past? And there can be precedents. Sometimes they will look at a higher court's decision, and sometimes they'll look at other courts and other districts, how they've decided as well. All right, so these are the Cherry Sisters, which basically created this idea of allowing public criticism. And they weren't necessarily, it wasn't that public criticism didn't exist, right? It's always existed. People since the dawn of time have watched something and said if they liked it or disliked it, but it created that legal precedent, that threshold, where all of a sudden in other cases, they would look to that case and say, well, the Iowa Supreme Court decided that that was allowed, that according to our Constitution, that was protected. All right. So the homework, we're going to keep going, but the homework for this week on Canvas, on Canvas is this media law questionnaire. These are 22 questions, and we're going to use these as the way to move through media law. So they're kind of categorized, and you're going to move through them. We're going to start talking about them today. But I want you to go through this by Wednesday. I want you to just go through it and just read it and tell me if you think yes or no. You don't have to do research. You don't have to research it. I just want you to tell me yes or no and kind of think about it, because we're going to start having these conversations in class. All right. So make sure that you go through this questionnaire. Kendall?
So we need to like make a copy and say yes or no. Do we need to explain why on all of them?
We're going to talk about it in class. So I just want to make sure that you've done it, that you've thought about it. Tosin? Yes, I would love if you submit it. Submit it to Google so that I can make sure that you've done it by Wednesday, by class on Wednesday. I think you'll have to do it on Google Docs. Yeah. All right. Okay. So the Cherry Sisters kind of created this idea, or, you know, it's an idea that's existed before, but it falls under the broad umbrella of what we call defamation. Defamation is the act of damaging someone's good reputation. So we all have a reputation in this room. You have a reputation that sometimes can be super valuable, right? There are, you know, we could talk a very long time about how good Tiger Woods' reputation was, right? And he was very valuable. He had tons of advertisements, tons of sponsorships, and it took a really big hit when a bunch of information came out about him, about his affairs, right? So people can make a lot of money on their reputation, and their reputation is protected. Defamation is when someone does something that can hurt your reputation, right? So if I say something that's false about you and it hurts your reputation, that is defamation. You will not be tried for defamation. It's too broad of a topic. It's too far-reaching. But under defamation is libel and slander. Libel is written defamation, and slander is spoken defamation. So think about like the two S's, spoken is slander, right? So in the legal world, if the defamation is written, it's different, it's considered different, a different burden than if the defamation is spoken. Written and spoken are different.
So, I'm sorry, could you just clarify?
Yeah.
So defamation is when you damage someone's reputation, but does it matter whether what you're saying to damage their reputation is truthful or not?
So the burden in court of whether or not you can be tried, like if you can be found guilty, is if it's true. If it's true in the United States, we'll talk more about that. If it's true, then you're off. Like if you said something that was true and you uncovered it, that's fair. Defamation is like a lie. Is like if I lied or said something that was false about you, then you can be held liable for defamation. Tosin? If they have a bad reputation, it would be a harder, the court proceeding would be a lot more difficult to say that you made their reputation worse, right? Like, so, I mean, yeah, your defamation is it's saying basically my reputation took a hit. So maybe I had a bad reputation and then you like called me a murderer and maybe that wasn't true, right? If that had the ability to make my reputation worse, then that would be considered defamation. Sophia?
Can't you say that whatever you say is just your opinion, even though it's in your reputation?
Oh, like an op-ed, like writing an op-ed about something. I think, well, I mean, I think there's a very clear difference in reporting something that making the audience believe that it is a fact is very different than, for example, the sisters, the Cherry sisters, they were saying, we don't think that this is a good act, right? So that,
So like how it's presented, if it's being presented as fact in a way.
yeah.
Like something that can be verified, like the whole, like if you say that someone was murdered by someone else, that be considered defamation.
Yeah, or if I say Cole cheated, right? And it's not based in anything, that's defamation, right? If I said Cole cheated, what kind of defamation is that? Yes, because it's said, right? And you could prove whether or not it's true or false, you know? He didn't cheat, I was lying, that's considered slander, right? We're gonna get to that. I think we'll get to the nuances of like what threshold journalists should be held accountable for. Why historically do you think that we have a difference between written defamation and spoken defamation? Erin?
Before things were like televised and stuff, if it was written down, like it could spread to a lot of people, whereas if it was spoken, it was harder for that information to like spread.
Yep. Other ideas, Mandy?
It's also just the way that the information changes. If it's slander and it spreads from person to person, it can change over time. The libel, it's written and stagnant. You can't, like you can't represent it. Generally, it's going to still be the same.
The permanence of it, the transitory of the permanence. Other ideas? The difference between why they might distinguish Tosin? There might be more what? Uh-huh. Oh, maybe tone. So you're saying like tone might be misconstrued. Mm-hmm. Which do you think is worse, written or spoken? Written? Shane, why do you think written is worse?
I would say just when people are talking, it's very easy to not be able to go back and reconcile what just happened, I guess. When things are written down before we take notes, but not just, you know, like.
That's why everyone's taking notes, right?
I don't know, I would just say that. I guess that's my argument.
Shay?
I feel like there can be more intent behind something you write, because as you're writing it, you're gonna have a moment to think about it before. I mean, even if it's just a tweet, you're gonna look at it before you hit the send button. So that means you really need to say that. And if it's just you're speaking it, you can be caught up in the moment in some argument and say some bad thing about some person that isn't really true.
Okay, so maybe the reach of it, maybe the intent of it, maybe the permanence of it. Michael? Forgotten. Yeah. Cole?
Well, it also provides a fair amount of plausible deniability with all. If you just sort of insinuate through print, it's much more easier to say, well, I never actually said that. I just sort of insinuated it, whereas the tone is very, very easy to get across through speaking. So like you can sort of tell when someone on TV is being sarcastic or they're being.
So you agree with Tosin that tone is about it? Yeah. Kendall?
With libel, especially when you're trying to argue for cases legally, you just pick up the paper that it was written in and there's your evidence. With slander, you have to have several, like you can't just have like one person that's like, well, this person told me this thing. You have to have several people, and so the burden of proof, you have to have more evidence for it. You have to find more people that heard this thing, that can attest that it was a lie, and can attest that they heard it from this person.
Yeah, so it gets at the audience of it. Mandy?
I feel like you could probably make a devil's advocate case with slander, just because one, it's like a game of telephone. It changes over time.
So maybe it's inherently worse because it's not written down.
And then also it's like, I don't know, I feel like when you talk to someone, like if I tell Erin something and then she tells like Cole something, then that's gonna spread faster than if I like showed her a piece of paper and then she took the paper because it's like one thing.
Maybe on Wednesday we'll play a game of telephone. I don't know how we'll do that with social distancing, unfortunately.
So are you
But
saying it depends on if it's like,
I think that
like published? Like,
I think it mostly depends like on
she's saying that it.
as bad. I don't necessarily think of
Because it's not permanent. It could become worse.
Yeah.
What was said could become worse. Okay, how would you qualify in today's? So this was all created. Aaron's right. Back when the only mass media we had was printing. We would print newspapers. We would print pamphlets and distribute them. We would print flyers and put them up on doors and around town. Right? If it was written, it could reach more people. But so that distinction between it being said, right? It's a smaller audience. If I say something to Jake, and he's like, "Well, it's a he said, she said." I don't know, right? There's not as many audience of people. But what would you all say about a text message now? Like a text message is written. Would that be considered libel or slander? If you had to argue that. Ashley, you're shaking your head. So these ideas were created a while ago, but now you're a modern judge dealing with a case with a text message. Shane?
We just text or can we do social media, like Jake was talking tweets.
Do you think that those would be different? Would you view tweets and text messages differently?
No. They're public. Like we had to do with this actually because there was a Instagram account that started spreading like lies and rumors and stuff, and that was liable because it's public Instagram account.
Okay, Jake?
I think you have to think about text as like a letter because you're sending it to someone, it's a personal message, but it's also written out and it's meant just for them. And I think it's kind of the same thing as a letter. So if you were going to treat a letter as libel, then I would treat a text message as libel.
Okay, we are running out of time, but today's judges would say that libel, that written word, is intended for larger audiences. So if it was intended for large audiences, it was going to defame to a lot of people. That would be libel, whereas a text message might be intended for one person, which would be more of a slander. So they think, again, I might be talking to multiple people. Usually the text message is instead of thinking about intent, like the intent to make something permanent, it is thought about the audience of the reach of what is there. Okay, this is perfect timing. We're gonna get into that quiz on Wednesday. So just look at it, copy and paste it into a Google Doc and put yes, no, yes, no.